Do you believe African countries are really independent after the colonial masters left? Well, in history books, African students are told that Europeans developed them and left the continent after their independence. But the irony is that the universities and educational institutions are run on the funding given by the Western countries to brainwash and hide the facts.
This time round, they are so subtle that we don't even recognize them, but they control us. What are we going to do about it in order to develop? We must do something.
Not many people know how the European countries are still controlling African countries, forcing their leaders to make policies that are in Europe's interest. In turn, the West ensures those African leaders come into office who have weaknesses and can be manipulated. That's what PLO Lumumba, a Kenyan lawyer and former director of the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, said in his latest speech that sent shockwaves to the West.
You who have been trained in this institution, you have traveled the world. You have traveled Nigeria. There are two things that you can do with your traveling. You can marvel. Says it is great in China. You can marvel. You can wonder or feel pain. I'm urging you to feel pain. To feel pain for the continent of Africa, and in your own way, when you go out there, go and do.
But what more did he say? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will tell you how PLO Lumumba has exposed the West's latest covert operations in Africa that will change everything. Let's get started. PLO Lumumba has always been unapologetic about his stance on the West and how it exploits Africa to this day. He does not shy away from saying the forbidden, which other leaders would think twice and never say about the West. In his latest speech, Lumumba emphasized the reality that African nations, though politically independent, still remain under the control of foreign interests. He asked everyone to note the pattern of global elites, like Bill Gates, Tony Blair, and Emmanuel Macron, visiting African leaders to subtly dictate policies in exchange for aid or investment. This modern form of colonialism allows external powers to dominate African economies without direct occupation. Through financial and political leverage, foreign nations maintain significant influence over African policy decisions.
You'll see Bill Gates come and meet your president. You'll see Tony Blair come and meet your president. You'll see Macron come and meet your president. You'll see all of them. And then they will never admit, but they'll be told, if you want money in agriculture, behave this way. If you want money in this area, behave this way. They will never tell that to the Chinese. They will never tell that to the
Bretton Woods institutions, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, are prime examples of how neocolonialism operates. During the 1980s and 1990s, many African nations were forced to adopt structural adjustment programs to secure loans. These programs imposed austerity measures, such as cutting public spending, privatizing state assets, and opening markets to foreign investors. While these reforms were presented as necessary for economic stability, they often led to the collapse of local industries, higher poverty levels, and worsened social services. For instance, Zambia saw its copper industry fall after being privatized as part of IMF and World Bank requirements. The wealth generated from copper extraction largely benefited foreign companies, leaving Zambians worse off. Similarly, Ghana faced cuts in education and healthcare after accepting an IMF bailout in 1983, creating long-term social challenges. Lumumba argues that this form of external control is not imposed on nations like China, India, or South Korea, which have managed to retain their sovereignty while engaging with the global economy. For example, China's economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping allowed the country to attract foreign investment without surrendering control over key industries. Likewise, South Korea's industrialization post-World War II, guided by strong state intervention, safeguarded its economic independence from foreign exploitation. Lumumba draws parallels between the historical Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where European powers divided Africa for colonization, and today's geopolitical manipulation. He argues that foreign powers such as China, the US, France, and others are once again contesting for control of Africa's resources and markets through more covert means like economic deals, military alliances, and soft power influence. A major example of this is China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which funds large-scale infrastructure projects across Africa. From railways in Kenya to highways in Ethiopia, these projects have modernized parts of the continent, but have also saddled many African nations with enormous debt. Djibouti, for instance, owes over 70% of its GDP to China due to loans for infrastructure projects, raising concerns about long-term sovereignty. Countries like Sri Lanka have already experienced the consequences of debt traps, having leased its Hambantota port to China for 99 years after failing to repay loans. Western powers have also retained their influence in Africa. The U.S. Africa Command, called AFRICOM, has a presence in multiple African countries under the pretext of counterterrorism, though some critics argue that this serves as a means for the U.S. to maintain military and resource control. Similarly, France's military operations in the Sahel, under Operation Barkhane, have been seen as a continuation of France's neo-colonial dominance in West Africa, especially in former colonies like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Lumumba also highlights Africa's lag in technological infrastructure, citing Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, as an example. Despite its economic size, Nigeria struggles with something as basic as reliable internet access. Lumumba critiques the continent's fractured telecommunication systems, where each country operates with its own phone code and satellite service, severely limiting cross-border communication and trade. He compares Africa's situation with countries like India, which have developed integrated telecom networks that allow for seamless communication across vast regions. India's creation of the Unified Payments Interface, which facilitates digital transactions across the country, exemplifies how technology can drive development and financial inclusion. Africa, Lumumba argues, needs similar innovations to foster regional integration and economic growth.
It cannot be right that in Africa's largest economy, in Nigeria, I do not have internet at an institution that deals with security. You get the point that I'm trying to make? It cannot be right. And I know why we don't have internet connectivity. It is because we are divided.
While Lumumba points out Africa's many challenges, he also expresses hope, noting that Africans are becoming increasingly aware of the need to think long-term. He refers to Agenda 2063, a visionary framework developed by the African Union, which seeks to achieve a prosperous, united, and globally influential Africa by 2063. This ambitious plan covers sectors like health, education, democracy, governance, and climate change. However, the success of Agenda 2063 depends on Africa's ability to overcome obstacles like political instability, corruption, and continued foreign interference. Historically, countries like South Korea and Singapore have made great efforts by committing to long-term economic plans spanning decades, rather than focusing solely on short-term political gains. In Africa, Botswana serves as a rare example of successful, long-term governance. Since gaining independence in 1966, Botswana has carefully managed its diamond resources, invested in education, and maintained political stability, helping it achieve sustained economic growth. Instead of allowing its former colonial master to stay, Botswana ended all their deep roots within the country. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. PLO Lumumba said what Africa needs the most is industries. African nations are incredibly rich in natural resources, holding vast reserves of gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, nickel, lithium, and more. These materials are essential for industries like electronics, renewable energy, and automotive manufacturing. While they have the potential to generate immense wealth for the continent, many African countries are not reaping the full benefits. Instead of processing these raw materials into finished goods, they export them in their unprocessed state, earning much less than they could if they developed domestic industries to turn them into high-value products. That's because the European colonizers never allowed industries to flourish in African countries, and to this day, hurdles are created for industries to function in Africa. That's because Europe knows that if Africa industrializes, no one would buy finished products from European countries like Germany, whose economies are highly dependent on trade. You should know that exporting raw materials only captures a fraction of the potential value compared to exporting finished products. For instance, a country might sell raw diamonds or gold, but the real profit comes when these materials are turned into luxury goods like jewelry or advanced technology components. Similarly, raw copper, cobalt, and lithium are key in producing batteries for electric vehicles and other high-demand products. Countries with the industrial capacity to process these resources into finished goods are the ones making the biggest profits, while the nations supplying the raw materials lose out on the higher value end of the production chain. Take Congo as an example. The country holds a significant portion of the world's cobalt reserves, which are essential for batteries used in electric vehicles and smartphones. Yet much of Congo's cobalt is exported in its raw form, leaving other countries to process and turn it into valuable tech products. The processed products are then sold at prices far higher than what Congo earns from exporting the raw material. Similarly, Zambia, a major copper producer, exports large quantities of raw copper instead of processing it domestically. If Zambia had the industries to smelt copper and manufacture electrical goods, it could capture more of the value and create more jobs and wealth within the country. Therefore, to truly capitalize on their natural wealth, PLO Lumumba said that African countries should build industries capable of processing these raw materials into finished goods. This would not only help African nations retain more of the value from their resources, but it would also generate jobs, drive economic growth, and spur technological advancement. The solution is clear. African countries need to move up the value chain by developing industries that turn their raw materials into finished products. This shift will require substantial investments in infrastructure, technology, and education. By building factories, training a skilled workforce, and fostering innovation, African nations could dramatically boost their economic power. However, African countries should ensure that Western countries do not have any stake in new industries. Otherwise, these industries would be never able to run successfully. This transformation would bring widespread socioeconomic benefits. It would create millions of jobs in manufacturing, technology, and logistics, which could help reduce poverty and inequality. Furthermore, it would promote economic diversification, reducing reliance on raw commodity exports and making African economies stronger.
It cannot be right that in Africa's largest economy, in Nigeria, I do not have internet at an institution that deals with security. You get the point that I'm trying to make? It cannot be right. And I know why we don't have internet connectivity. It is because we are divided.
Lumumba also highlights Africa's dangerous dependency on imports, especially from China, which provides 80% of the manufactured goods consumed on the continent. This heavy reliance stifles local industries and keeps African economies tied to external powers. Lumumba warns that if China were to close shop, Africa would be in a dire situation. A historical parallel can be drawn with Japan in the early 20th century. Before becoming a global industrial giant, Japan was similarly dependent on foreign imports. However, the country made a deliberate decision to industrialize, invest in local manufacturing, and reduce its reliance on outside goods. This allowed Japan to become one of the world's leading economies. Lumumba argues that Africa must follow this model by encouraging local industries, creating jobs, and developing self-reliance to avoid being perpetually subservient to foreign powers. As of now, Africa is making progress, and it should continue. Lumumba praises the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was launched in Accra, Ghana, as a significant step toward economic integration. By creating a single market for goods and services across Africa, it aims to boost intra-African trade and reduce the continent's dependency on foreign markets. However, Lumumba cautions that without proper infrastructure, peace, and security, the full benefits will be difficult to realize. He draws a comparison to the United States, where a truck can travel safely and efficiently from Florida to Canada because of secure roads and strong infrastructure. Africa, however, faces challenges like insecurity and poor infrastructure that hinder the free movement of goods. Of course, PLO Lumumba knows who is behind the instability and who is benefiting from this situation. Lumumba expresses concern about the growing number of separatist movements across Africa. He warns that these internal divisions could weaken Africa's push for unity and undermine the progress made so far. He points to separatist sentiments in places like Barotseland in Zambia, the Caprivi Strip in Namibia, and the Biafra movement in Nigeria. The case of South Sudan serves as a warning. After decades of civil war, South Sudan seceded from Sudan in 2011. However, instead of peace and stability, the new nation quickly descended into its own civil war, plagued by rival factions and ethnic divisions. And if the situation is carefully studied, it can be easily known who is benefiting from all the separatism in Africa. Despite these challenges, Lumumba remains hopeful about Africa's future. He emphasizes that Africa has the youngest population in the world, which could be a tremendous asset if properly harnessed. Combined with the continent's abundant natural resources, Africa has the potential to become a global powerhouse. Countries that have successfully developed have made significant investments in their youth and human capital. For example, Singapore after independence focused heavily on education and workforce development, and today it is one of the most developed nations in the world. Lumumba argues that Africa must similarly invest in its youth, providing them with the education, skills, and opportunities to lead the continent into the future. However, the young generation should know the continued influence of former colonial powers, especially in controlling the continent's natural resources. Former colonial powers, especially France, have maintained exclusive access to Africa's natural wealth. Even after the end of colonial rule, many African countries signed agreements that gave their former colonizers continued rights over valuable resources like gold, oil, diamonds, and rare minerals. This means that while African nations technically own these resources, foreign corporations still control the extraction, sale, and profits from them. One of the key tools Lumumba highlights in maintaining this control is the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries and directly linked to the euro. While it may seem like a simple monetary system, Lumumba argues that the CFA franc gives France significant power over the economies of its former colonies. By controlling the currency, France influences trade, investment, and even the political stability of these African nations. Lumumba points out that this currency arrangement keeps these countries economically dependent. They cannot pursue independent monetary policies that suit their own needs, such as adjusting their currency value to boost exports or controlling inflation. Instead, they are forced to follow policies that benefit France, often at the expense of African development. Historically, this has been part of France's France-Afrique policy, which describes France's continued influence over its former colonies. Through economic ties, military support, and political patronage, France has maintained control over African nations. African leaders who challenge French interests often find themselves undermined or even overthrown, while those who align with French goals receive support. This system allows France to keep benefiting from Africa's resources, labor, and political structures, while African nations struggle to build independent economies. Lumumba argues that while African nations may appear independent on paper, they are far from truly free. The legacy of colonialism lives on through economic manipulation, debt, and currency controls. European powers, particularly through institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, use loans and debt to dictate the terms of trade and economic policy in African nations. These systems ensure that African economies remain dependent on exporting raw materials to Europe, rather than developing their own industries. What do you think? Can African leaders distance themselves from the West and handle the pressure that is put to protect Western interests? Why do African leaders have to always comply with whatever the West says, and why they cannot do what independent African leaders like IBRAHIM Traoré is doing? In the comment section right below, let us know if you agree with what PLO Lumumba said. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.